All right, thank you very much. So now we're moving on from the clinical lens to the neuroscience lens, and now maybe more biological lens, maybe philosophical lens. And the next speaker is Dr. Matthew Owen, who is a faculty member in the Department of Philosophy at Yakima Valley College. He's also affiliate member of our consciousness science, and been actively collaborating with him. Dr. Owen completed PhD in Birmingham, England, and then he was the Elizabeth Koch Research Fellow for the Tiny Blood Consciousness Foundation under the direction of Christoph Koch, who we all know very well. He's published many, many papers, and in particular, he's the author of the book, Measuring of the Immeasurable Mind, and I have a dedicated copy of that. So I'm pleased to have you and speak about covert consciousness, and I don't say the rest. You can do that.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Tony, for the kind introduction, and it's a great honor to be a part of this excellent symposium, and I want to thank Tony, Zuri, Kathy, and the whole Center for Consciousness Science for putting it on. I realize that it takes an awful lot of work, and I really appreciate it. So, my presentation today will focus on the possibility of covert consciousness in human brain organoids and relevant philosophy of mind. The primary take-home message that I hope to convince you of is that when it comes to discerning whether an entity such as a human cerebral organoid is conscious, we must not only consider physical conditions regarding neurobiology, but also metaphysical conditions about the nature of the conscious mind and how it relates to the brain. This is not to say that relevant neurobiology is unimportant. I think it is vitally important, and I have authored an article with Tony and Zuri and several other colleagues that applies neurobiology of consciousness to brain organoids. However, there is more that must be considered, specifically regarding philosophy of mind and how consciousness relates to its physical substrate, or so I will argue. My argument will essentially consist of presenting two different views in philosophy of mind about how consciousness relates to the brain that reveal how differing views in philosophy of mind can have profoundly different implications for whether cerebral organoids could be conscious. The first view I will discuss is materialism and its modern physicalist variant, which is still the most prominent philosophical view despite its prominence waning significantly in recent decades. I will then discuss hylomorphism, a view proposed by Aristotle and developed by Thomas Aquinas, which is undergoing a contemporary renaissance. But before considering these philosophical views, which reveal that philosophy of mind has profound implications for whether cerebral organoids could be conscious, I want to briefly clarify what human cerebral organoids are and their research purposes. In 2008, a research team in Japan reported generating from mice and human embryonic stem cells cortical tissues that self-organized into patterned structures mimicking the early aspects of corticogenesis. Then in 2011, while a postdoctoral researcher at the Institute of Molecular Biotechnology in Vienna, Madeline Lancaster, inadvertently grew cerebral organoids from human embryonic stem cells. Though she initially had no intention of doing so, Lancaster had produced multicellular, three-dimensional structures of cortical neurons, now known as human cerebral organoids. There are many different types of organoids that resemble different types of organs, such as kidney organoids, lung organoids, liver organoids, and so on. Human brain organoids are organoids that resemble parts or aspects of the human brain. Human cerebral organoids are one type of brain organoid which mimics the cerebrum, and they are hailed as one of the most promising recent developments in neuroscience due to their potential to advance our understanding of neuronal function within the brain and specifically the cerebrum. Human cerebral organoids are grown from human embryonic stem cells, but they can be, and on my view should be, and they very often are, grown from induced human pluripotent stem cells, which circumnavigates ethical concerns about the use of human embryos, thereby safeguarding public trust in science. And this can also allow the organoids to be useful for patient-specific drug screening. The organoids consist of brain cells that connect into networks and self-organize into structures of different cell types resembling brain regions in early development. Consisting of up to tens of millions of cells, a typical cerebral organoid that is only a few millimeters in size can serve as a biological model of the cerebrum that allows us to study its functions at the cellular level. Since the cerebral organoid is grown in vitro as an isolated entity, it is not obscured by the skull. And it provides unparalleled access for investigating how the brain's cellular mechanisms work, how the brain develops at its earliest stages, and how it can potentially maldevelop, and how we might most effectively treat it. Just how accurately cerebral organoids model the human brain, or particular areas of it, is debated. But insofar as they do accurately resemble the human brain in early development, they provide substantial promise for neurological progress. In addition to the standard neurological reasons for using organoids as biological research models, there are also more novel aims. In the emerging field of organoid intelligence, there are efforts to combine cerebral organoids with artificial intelligence to create original forms of intelligence and memory by leveraging the computational power of biological neural networks. Although the ultimate bioengineering goal, or perhaps you might say bioengineering dream, might be a whole brain organoid for comprehensive modeling of the brain's development and function, there is a very long way to go. Obstacles such as the challenge of providing vascularization for organoids prohibit their development to more mature stages. In addition to a lack of vascularization, a limitation regularly mentioned in discussions about whether cerebral organoids could be conscious is that they are isolated entities devoid of sense organs, and therefore they are incapable of receiving inputs from their environment. However, it has been reported that brain organoids can assemble primitive, light-sensitive optic vesicles, permitting inter-organ interaction studies. Furthermore, combining biological cerebral organoids with synthetic instruments engineered for relaying signals is another possible alternative to allow organoids to receive inputs from their environment. And Brett Kagan and colleagues have explored the possibility of integrating in vitro neurons in digital systems using in silico computing. They claim to have demonstrated that a single layer of in vitro cortical neurons can self-organize activity to display intelligent and sentient behavior when embodied in a simulated game world. While this report is alarming, whether it should be understood as reporting genuine sentience requires careful analysis. The researchers who conducted another study, which also raised eyebrows and media attention, reported that cortical organoids can spontaneously develop periodic and regular oscillatory network electrical activity resembling the electroencephalography EEG patterns of preterm babies. A machine learning model based on a preterm newborn's EEG features ranging from 24 to 38 weeks was able to predict the organoid culture's age based on the electrical activity of the organoid itself. Basically, the software found no significant difference between EEG patterns of preterm babies and patterns in the cortical organoid. Such studies make evident a tension, or as Andre Lavazza puts it, a double-edged sword, in brain organoid research. On the one hand, the more human brain organoids actually replicate the human brain or specific areas of it, that should be reason for celebration, given that such models can help us better understand the organ that directly supports our conscious mental lives. On the other hand, however, that same reason to celebrate can also be a cause for concern that the organoids could become conscious, which, given their human genetic origins, would seem to imply that they are conscious human subjects with a corresponding moral status and corresponding rights. But if brain organoids did become conscious, their consciousness would likely be covert. It is most likely that the only way we could know whether they are covertly conscious is by observing their neural activity, insofar as they are isolated entities lacking the required body parts to perform behavioral indicators of consciousness. To discern whether a brain organoid were conscious using neural indicators of consciousness, we would need to know what neural mechanisms make consciousness physically possible. But we would also need to know how consciousness relates to those neural mechanisms, and specifically whether consciousness relates in such a way that the presence of the neural mechanisms always entails the presence of consciousness. This is because different philosophical views about how consciousness relates to the brain and its neural mechanisms have profoundly different implications for whether or not cerebral organoids could ever become conscious, as I will now demonstrate by contrasting materialism and physicalism with hylomorphism. Materialism is a commonly held position in contemporary philosophy and neuroscience, but its roots go back to ancient Greek philosophers. At the heart of materialism is the ontological claim that everything that exists is material, or at least has its basis in matter. Physicalism can be seen as materialism's close cousin that applies materialism specifically to the mind, claiming that it is physical, or is at least rooted in and determined by that which is physical. There are two general versions of physicalism, known as reductive physicalism and non-reductive physicalism. In his article, Sensations and Brain Processes, J.J.C. Smart defended the most well-known version of reductive physicalism, called the identity theory. Smart argued that correlations between conscious states and neural activity are best explained by an ontological identity relation. According to his identity theory, every conscious state is ontologically identical to neural activity that is present whenever the conscious state is present. Thus, there are not distinct entities, the conscious state and the neural activity, which are correlated. Rather, the conscious state is the neural activity, meaning that they are the same entity. And that explains why the conscious state and the neural activity are consistently correlated with one another. One advantage of this explanation of neural correlations from the physicalist vantage point is that consciousness is not sui generis, but fits the ontological view of the world that says everything is physical. Another advantage is its parsimony, or simplicity, as it only posits the existence of one kind of thing, that is, physical neurons, rather than two kinds of things, that is, physical neurons and conscious states. However, such ontological parsimony is only advantageous insofar as it does not entail explanatory poverty or inadequacy. Some philosophers and neuroscientists have argued that physicalism is ultimately explanatorily incapable of accounting for consciousness and its phenomenal properties. Others have tried to maintain a physicalist framework while facing the hard problem of consciousness and the challenge of reducing phenomenal consciousness to its physical substrate. Accounting for consciousness while being faithful to physicalism has led some to embrace non-reductive physicalism. The non-reductive physicalist claims that at least some mental properties cannot be reduced to physical properties, but maintains that there are only physical substances. The idea is that everything is physical, even though there are some physical entities, such as human beings, which have non-physical mental properties. Given that non-reductive physicalism permits the existence of non-physical properties, it prompts a question about what physicalism ultimately amounts to, or what is essential to physicalism. The prominent defender of physicalism, Jaegwon Kim, argued that there are at least several tenets essential to physicalism. 1, physics is ontologically fundamental. 2, mind-body supervenience. And 3, the causal closure of the physical domain. Both mind-body supervenience and the causal closure of the physical domain safeguard the primacy of physics and the idea that what is ontologically fundamental is physical. While there are stronger and weaker versions of the tenets, supervenience says that all mental properties are determined by their physical substrate, and causal closure flows out of supervenience as it precludes any non-physical causes of physical effects. According to Kim, mind-body supervenience entails that creatures could not be psychologically different and yet physically identical. Or we can say, wrote Kim, when describing supervenience, Any two things that are exact physical duplicates necessarily are exact psychological duplicates as well. That is, physical duplicates are duplicates to core. Supervenience precludes the possibility of an unconscious physical duplicate of a conscious being, which philosophers sometimes call zombies. Given that supervenience is essential to physicalism, it appears that physicalism implies that cerebral organoids could become conscious, regardless of whether consciousness is reductive or non-reductive. Since reductive physicalism says consciousness is ontologically identical to the neural mechanisms that are its physical substrate, the presence of those neural mechanisms in a cerebral organoid would imply the presence of consciousness in the organoid. Likewise, non-reductive physicalism also implies that if neural mechanisms that are the physical substrate of consciousness are present in a cerebral organoid, then consciousness is present as well, because consciousness necessarily supervenes upon the neural mechanisms. So once we know what neural mechanisms in the human brain are the physical substrate of consciousness, we could also know whether consciousness is in a cerebral organoid, based on whether those neural mechanisms are in the organoid. This is because consciousness is identical to the neural mechanisms, or at least supervenes on them, according to physicalism. There are, however, two materialist views, eliminative materialism and behaviorist materialism, that appear to avoid the implication that cerebral organoids could become conscious. According to eliminative materialism, consciousness is not a real feature of the world, but a folk concept that well-informed individuals can eliminate from their vocabulary, since the concept does not actually refer to anything in reality. The implication is that nothing, including cerebral organoids, could be conscious. According to behaviorist materialism, consciousness is not identical to neural mechanisms, but rather physical behaviors that even the most highly developed brain organoids would never be capable of, insofar as they remain isolated organoids. For example, if the conscious state of being aware of a wall in one's environment is identical to the physical behavior of navigating around the wall so as not to run into it, then an isolated and immobile cerebral organoid could not be in such a conscious state. That could easily change, however, if a brain organoid gained biological or synthetic appendages allowing it to perform such behaviors. This possibility is not far-fetched or futuristic, considering the unpublished work done in Alison Moultrie's lab, described by Thomas Hartung and colleagues as follows. Moultrie's team connected a brain organoid to a spider-shaped robot, allowing the organoid's electrical activity to control the robot's movements. The robot's sensors detected when it was close to a wall, and the computer relayed those signals back to the organoid in the form of electrical pulses. In another experiment, Moultrie's lab taught a robot to walk and navigate its environment using the electrical activity from the neural oscillations of brain organoids. These organoids do not seem far from performing behaviors via attached robotic limbs, that are identical to conscious states from the standpoint of behaviorist materialism. So eliminative materialism is one version of materialism and physicalism that does not appear to imply that brain organoids could become conscious, since it denies that consciousness exists. The other versions I've mentioned, that is, reductive and non-reductive physicalism and behaviorist materialism, imply that brain organoids could become conscious once they manifest the physical substrate of consciousness, whether it is neural mechanisms or physical behaviors. Yet, insofar as the idea that brain organoids could become conscious is an unwelcome conclusion, suggesting that their research, development, and use is morally suspect, there are ways one might try to avoid developing brain organoid consciousness. Brain organoid consciousness could be avoided if the physical substrate of consciousness were known and the growth of organoids were limited or guided so they do not develop the physical substrate of consciousness. Alternatively, a physicalist rightly bothered by the possibility of brain organoid consciousness might object to the idea that it is truly possible by arguing that the neural mechanisms in a brain organoid which replicate neural mechanisms in the brain are not the same kind of mechanisms because they are not a part of the same whole. However, this idea coheres much more with hylomorphism than physicalism. In a recent article on consciousness science published in Nature, Alex Gomez-Marin and Anil Seth rightly point out that, quote, although the materialist credo remains dominant, many other isms are available, and dozens of theories depart from standard materialist assumptions. One such ism is hylomorphism, which, despite falling out of prominence in the early modern era, is undergoing a contemporary renaissance, as evidenced by this small sample of recent publications arguing for hylomorphism, or the broader Aristotelian framework that it's a part of. Hylomorphism is a view that originated with Aristotle, whose metaphysical system of thought has enjoyed one of the longest periods of intellectual consensus and tradition in Western philosophy. Consequently, there is an assortment of interpretations of Aristotle and developments of hylomorphism by prominent Aristotelian philosophers. I will here be discussing a version of hylomorphism that originated with Aristotle and was developed by Thomas Aquinas. Hylomorphism can be applied to philosophy of mind, yet it is fundamentally a metaphysical view about all material objects. The word hylomorphism is a compound Greek word with hyla meaning matter and morphe meaning form. As these words together constitute the word hylomorphism, a real form and matter together constitute each material object. In Metaphysics Z17, Aristotle asks why some matter composes a house, while other matter composes a body. His answer is that each material entity is composed of matter plus a form in virtue of which the matter is unified into one thing of a particular kind. Broadly speaking, there are two kinds of material objects, aggregates and substances. Aggregates are externally unified material objects that are unified by an accidental form. A wood table is an aggregate composed of 4 wooden legs combined with a flat piece of wood resting on the legs. The structural configuration of the legs plus the flat piece is the accidental form, uniting the wooden parts into a table. All the wooden parts exist prior to existing as parts of the table. But once they are configured into the structure of a table, then the table begins to exist, along with its powers, such as its capacity to suspend a computer several feet above the floor. The existence of the table and its powers emerge once the parts are properly configured. By contrast, substances are material objects internally unified by a substantial form. Unlike the powers of aggregates, essential powers of substances do not emerge from the parts of the substance being properly configured. Rather, the parts of a substance come to be and come to have the structural configurations they have because the substantial form of the substance has particular powers requiring such parts for their natural manifestation. There are 3 general types of substantial forms, called vegetative souls, which have the powers necessary for biological life, sensory souls, which have the powers for life, plus the power to sense, and rational souls, which have the aforementioned powers, plus the power of rationality. Consciousness enters this taxonomy via sensory souls, as the power to sense amounts to what is referred to today as the capacity to be conscious, or more specifically, phenomenally conscious. In De Anima, Aristotle argues that the form of a natural living body, such as Socrates' body, is Socrates' soul. Aquinas followed Aristotle and likewise argued that the form that unifies a human body is a human soul, which is a rational soul with the power to sense, that is, to be conscious. From this hylomorphic perspective, there is no need to explain how the aurora borealis of a single unified conscious experience emerges from countless neural nuts and bolts, because consciousness is ontologically and explanatorily prior to its neural mechanisms. It does not emerge from or supervene upon the neural mechanisms, like the table's power to suspend objects emerges from the proper configuration of its parts. Rather, Aquinas thought that the human body and all its parts exists because its substantial form, a rational soul that also has sensory and vegetative powers, relies on bodily organs to manifest all its powers, including rational understanding. Aquinas makes this evident in his response to a question about whether a human rational soul ought to be united to a human body. According to Aquinas, it is necessary that the body, which is united to a rational soul, be the kind that is best fitted for being of service to the soul and whatever understanding demands. And he thought human rational understanding relies on information gained from sensing the world, and therefore human rationality requires sensing. Aquinas thought that the human rational soul sensed the world to acquire information used to reason, and that this sensing required sufficient bodily organs. Consequently, he concluded that the body to which a rational soul is united must be arranged in the best possible way for the operation of sensing. This hylomorphic view strikingly diverges from emergentist views of consciousness because hylomorphism is a substantial form with the capacity to sense or be conscious does not emerge due to sufficiently ordered matter, such as a sufficiently structured brain. For the soul, writes Aquinas, about the substantial form of a human being, does not depend on the body for its existence. Rather, it is just the opposite. The existence of the body and the nature of its parts depend on the substantial form. Aquinas clarifies, speaking of a substantial form, that it is not because matter is ordered in a certain fashion that a particular kind of form is united to it, but rather because the form is of a certain kind, it is necessary that its matter be ordered in such a way. Because the substantial form that grounds the existence of a human being has the power to sense, it has a brain sufficiently structured. Hence, Aquinas makes the following empirical claim. If anyone wants to examine also the particular organs of the human body, he will discover that they are organized so that a human being might sense most effectively. Consequently, because a well-ordered brain is necessary for the effective condition of the internal sense powers, for example, the imagination, the memory, and the cogitative power, a human being was made in such a way that in proportion to his size, he has a brain that is larger than that of any other animal. According to this hylomorphic explanatory reasoning, the human being as a whole and its substantial form, which has the capacity for consciousness, is ontologically and explanatorily prior to its biological parts, including the brain. And it is the human being, not the brain itself, that has the power to sense or be conscious. The brain is, however, a necessary biological part of the human body for the human being to naturally manifest the capacity to be conscious. The notion of mind-body dependence that Aquinas applied to the level of organs is applied to the cellular and subcellular levels by the mind-body powers model of neural correlates of consciousness. This model has been applied to the subject of empirically detecting and measuring covert consciousness in behaviorally unresponsive patients. According to the model, consciousness is a mental power of human subjects and many animals that naturally co-manifests with bodily powers, which are manifested via the activity of specific neuronal correlates of consciousness. Therefore, covert consciousness in a behaviorally unresponsive patient can be empirically detected based on the activity of neural correlates of consciousness. Since the model provides a philosophical basis for detecting covert consciousness in human subjects, one might think that the model does the same with respect to human cerebral organoids. However, from the hylomorphic perspective that informs the mind-body powers model, there are multiple reasons for thinking brain organoids are not entities capable of being conscious. First, from the hylomorphic perspective, creatures capable of being conscious have a brain to exercise this power, but consciousness is not a capacity of a brain itself. It is a capacity of the creature or subject, such as a human being, and more specifically, their substantial form that unifies the whole biological creature. Consciousness is not a power of any one biological part, even though its manifestation does rely most directly on a particular biological part, that is the brain, which the power of consciousness is manifested through. So although the brain is the organ that the human being most directly relies on to manifest the power to be conscious, the brain does not itself possess the power to be conscious. Second, even if the brain itself were capable of being conscious, a brain in isolation is not actually a brain, according to hylomorphism. And therefore, an isolated brain organoid would likewise not be a brain. All the parts of a natural body that is a substance are unified by the same single substantial form that grounds the existence of all the biological parts and their unity into one body. Such parts are called inseparable parts because their existence depends on their being a part of the whole of which they are a part. Removing the part from the whole substance it is a part of changes its nature, because the part exists as what it is only as a part of the whole. Aristotle claims that a substance's parts, quote, cannot even exist if severed from the whole, for it is not a finger in any state that is the finger of a living thing, but a dead finger is a finger only homonymously. In light of this homonymy principle, if someone's finger is severed from her body, then it is no longer, strictly speaking, literally a finger. Now, the most common example, which you may have heard of before, is a hand, but that's just a rendition of what Aristotle says about a finger. Now, the same is true for the person's brain, or a replica of it. We might call the removed organ a brain, or the replica a mini-brain. But neither is a brain in the strict sense, because a brain is by nature a part of a whole biological creature. So even if it were the case that brains themselves have capacity to be conscious, isolated replicas of the brain, such as human brain organoids, are not brains anyway. Third, the functions of neural mechanisms in cerebral organoids, or any type of brain organoid, are not the same as the functions of the neural mechanisms in a brain that they replicate. To illustrate this point, imagine that I were walking by your home while carrying a book that I was tired of holding. So I set the book down on your front doorstep. Now consider an Amazon delivery person who likewise walks up to your house and sets a copy of the same book which you ordered the day before on your doorstep. Our acts may appear to be identical functions. However, what I did was basically littering, whereas what the Amazon delivery person did was make a delivery. The Amazon delivery person's function was a delivery, whereas my function was not, because the Amazon delivery person is a part of a whole system, a company. And the essence of their function is determined by the whole of which they are a part. Given hylomorphism, the same could be said of the functions of neural mechanisms in cerebral organoids that replicate specific functions in the cerebrum. Even if they are an exact replica, they are not truly the same functions, because specific neural functions that are a part of a whole biological system, which includes not only the whole brain, but also a body, are not the same as isolated replicas that are not a part of such a larger whole. And you can infer how this would apply to artificial neural networks as well. Yet one might reasonably ask, what if a brain organoid were combined with other organoids or synthetic appendages so that a larger whole came about that could interact with its environment? As mentioned earlier, this is possible. And when dealing with this question from a hylomorphic perspective, it is critical to remember that it is the accidental forms of aggregates and their powers that can emerge due to the arrangement or structure of physical parts. But such accidental forms do not have the power to be conscious, which enters the Aristotelian taxonomy as a defining capacity of sensory substantial forms. And a conscious creature unified by a sensory substantial form is not built from the ground up by adding physical parts until a sensory substantial form emerges, along with its capacity to be conscious. In other words, a sensory substantial form and its power to be conscious does not supervene on physical properties. Therefore, from this hylomorphic perspective, there is little reason to worry that consciousness will at some point emerge from neural mechanisms in a cerebral organoid. The only way that a brain organoid could be conscious is if it were a substance unified by a substantial form with the capacity to be conscious from the beginning of its existence. And given the homonymy principle, once the cells used to grow human brain organoids are removed from the human body they are derived from, they are no longer informed by the same form as that body. As a result, they are no longer the same kind of thing any more than the oak wood constituting a table is an oak tree. Human cerebral organoids are only human in the sense that the organoids are generated from cells derived from humans. Some biological powers, which are physically rooted in the cells, will remain, but there is no reason to think the mental power to be conscious will remain, as it is the power of the substantial form unifying the body from which the cells were removed. Given hylomorphism, human brain organoids are genuinely biological models of the human brain, nothing more and nothing less. In light of the theoretical justification that physicalism and hylomorphism offer for opposite conclusions about whether cerebral organoids could become conscious, it is evident that discerning whether such organoids could be covertly conscious will require careful consideration of not only the relevant neurobiology, but also the relevant philosophy of mind. With that said, I will conclude with a slide of appreciation for those who have helped me in various ways as I have been working on a series of research projects on cerebral organoids. And thank you very much for your kind attention, and I'll open it up now for your questions and comments.
Thank you for the talk. It was very inspirational. I didn't get the last part about the possibility of adding the sensory, another organoid for like retina, for example, to see to provide the sensory information to the organoid, and you said like sensory substance to the organoid, for example. So then it may form a internal model. And if you think that teleological, like the purpose of that entity being able to model the world is what defines the existence of the brain or conscious brain, and if it can receive information from the outside and can model the sensory world inside, then wouldn't it be conscious? Yeah, that's my question.
I think that if you assume that that's what consciousness is, then you might be able to argue more easily that then it could potentially be conscious. If you assume that consciousness is a representational model of the outside world, then I think that you could argue that it is conscious. Essentially, what I'm saying, though, is that from the hylomorphic perspective, that's not what consciousness ultimately amounts to. Ultimately, what consciousness is a capacity of a conscious creature, of a conscious subject, that is a whole entity that isn't built from adding parts until you get this conscious subject that emerges with the capacity to be conscious.
That thing I didn't understand, because I saw the diagram of like yellow and orange, and the blue things emerge from bottom to top, and you again told us that like consciousness is something conscious thing has in itself, and I think it's kind of like circular argument. And I understand you are not trying to define it as some kind of function. It's just inherent property, but I'm not clear why the organoid cannot have that property.
Yeah, from the standpoint of hylomorphism, the basic idea is that sensory substantial forms aren't the kind of thing that emerge from its physical substrate. So I think that we are probably just coming at this from two different views. One of emergentist view versus hylomorphism. And according to hylomorphism, sensory substantial forms aren't emergent entities. They don't depend upon the physical substrate. Rather, the physical substrate depends upon the substantial form. And the substantial form grounds the existence of the physical parts that are used to manifest the sensory capacities of a sensory substantial form. And so I realize that it's basically just kind of the opposite way of viewing how the mind relates to the body than what is typically assumed in consciousness science and philosophy of mind. It basically turns supervenience of physicalism on its head. So hopefully that was okay in answering your question, but we can talk more about it afterwards too.
Thanks for the talk. I had so at multiple points in the talk you equated consciousness and sensing. And it seems to me that there are many cases of unconscious sensing. And more generally, I was thinking about what hylomorphism has to say about the following case, which was, I think, the result of an experiment by Pflüger in the 19th century, which is the case of the headless frog. So what Pflüger discovered is that if you put acetic acid on the thigh of a headless frog, it will actually try to remove the acid, even though it doesn't have a head. Okay? So, that seems to be unconscious sensing of the acid. In the same way, if you put a headless frog underwater, it will swim to the surface. Or if you put an inverted jar in its path, it will swim out of the jar back to the surface. So that's all done without a head. So my question is that unconscious sensing? And the second question is, does hylomorphism then, if that's sensing and if all sensing is conscious, does hylomorphism imply that you have consciousness in the spinal cord of frogs?
Yeah, that's a great question, and just a really good, I'm hesitant to call it a counterexample because I'm not exactly entirely sure what to make of it. But yeah, I am assuming that sensing and consciousness are synonymous in this particular context. And that is because I would define consciousness as, in the same way that Christoph Koch would, as experience. And I think that when we're talking about consciousness, what is essentially phenomenal consciousness, not necessarily access consciousness. Although I'm kind of a pluralist when it comes to exactly how to define consciousness, I don't think that we have to come up with some tidy definition that's going to apply to every instance that we might be talking about consciousness. But I do typically define consciousness as experience. Given that living sensory entities have the capacity to sense on the Aristotelian taxonomy, I would say that they are conscious. So how do I make sense of the example of the frog that you gave, which, again, is a really good example and very interesting? So I would say that there can be reactions to stimuli that are unconscious. I think that when I'm seeing a line that requires a ton of concentration, I'm reacting a lot. It's just muscle memory. But if I were to consciously think about my reactions, they would be too slow to actually be useful. And I wouldn't be skiing very well. I'm in a state of flow where I'm not thinking about everything. So I do think that there are behavioral reactions that are unconscious. Now, the example of the frog that you gave, though, that is a particularly good example that raises more difficulty for me, because it does seem like somehow the frog is aware of like where on its body it is, and also that it's like a threat, and yeah, really, to be fully honest, I don't know what to make of it. But I am open to saying that there could be some information that may be conscious, that is processed by the nervous system, by the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system of the frog. And I don't necessarily think that it's impossible that the frog did in such a way to its environment that foreign chemicals, like an acid, that frogs would have developed like just a natural reaction to get them off. I mean, if something is going toward our eye, we don't consciously think, oh, yeah, I need to, shut my eyelid. We just shut our eyelid, and that's why it's such an effective protective mechanism. And I don't think that it's out of the realm of possibilities that the frog would be doing something like that that's just automated within its nervous system.
I agree. That's a good reason for thinking it's unconscious.
Well, in that case, we're talking about a frog without a head. Am I correct? Okay. Well, that wouldn't rule out the possibility that it's conscious when headed.
After.
You know, we're talking about a completely different scenario than headed frogs when we're talking about beheaded frogs. So thank you very much for your question.
A small remark about Aristotle. He does not believe that the soul can exist without the body. Right? In De Anima, he says it's foolish to believe that a soul could exist past the death of its body any more than the sound of a lyre could exist past the destruction of the lyre. Instead, he sees the soul as its first actuality of the body, or basically a causal structure that reproduces itself through implementing the structure of the body. And so they are more intertwined. I think this is a misunderstanding, this idea that the soul, despite being primary in understanding living nature, because it's the causal structure of the body, could exist without it. I don't know, to my question, how to engage with your philosophical approach of trying to resolve the factual and moral question if the brain organoid is capable of experience and suffering by choosing a different philosophical belief system until you like it. So I'll ask a different question. How is this different if you play with a brain organoid than playing with the brain of a guinea pig that might have a similar size, similar complexity, similar behavior? Do you see a moral, practical, factual difference there?
So there definitely are various interpretations of Aristotle, and you're right that he doesn't think that the soul can exist apart from the body. Now, whether or not he thinks that the mind can exist, I think that is an open question that he actually leaves open himself. And I specifically was more so focused on a version of hylomorphism that I would say originated with Aristotle and then was subsequently developed by Thomas Aquinas. And Thomas Aquinas did very clearly think that the soul could exist apart from the body, but at the same time, though, too, that's neither here nor there with respect to how...
But he was a religious philosopher. I'm not sure if this is important for the question whether the brain organoids are conscious, right? Aristotle also only gets 80% of everything right. He was very early on. So I think this is only of academic interest. But for the practical question whether the brain organoid is conscious, I don't think that your belief system matters. What matters is whether it's actually capable of experience and whether and how you can establish that, right? And so I have big epistemological differences with your approach that you think just by arranging a system of words together you can resolve that question. You need to establish practical criteria. But my question was more, if you compare the brain organoid to a similar brain, like the brain of a guinea pig, that you take out of the skull of the guinea pig and now you start to torture, do you see a difference between the brain organoid and this thing which looks and functions maybe similarly to the brain organoid that is derived from human cells?
Yeah, I do. But also...
How does this criterion work? I'm just interested in your moral criterion and your philosophical criterion.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to what you said first about your interpretation of Aristotle. And then I was getting to what I was going to say about how hylomorphism applies to brain organoids. And just to go back to the second part of your original comment, I'm not picking and choosing. I'm not a hylomorphist because I think that hylomorphism gives us leeway to do this type of research on human brain organoids. And if I'm wrong about how hylomorphism applies to brain organoids, I'm very happy to be convinced that I am mistaken. I'm a hylomorphist for other reasons, for other philosophical reasons. But given that I am a hylomorphist, and given that I do think that hylomorphism implies that human brain organoids are merely biological models of the human brain, and that they are not human beings or sensory beings with the capacity to sense, then I don't see why we shouldn't use them as biological models of the human brain. And I think that this actually, I think that at the heart of the second part of your comment is a concern about animals, right, and them suffering. But if human brain organoids are unconscious entities, and we do more research on them rather than animal models in order to better understand the human brain, that actually reduces the overall amount of suffering and reduces animal suffering. And so why not use them for research? It reduces animal suffering, and it allows us to better understand how the brain works in order to reduce human suffering as well. So I think it's a win-win for everyone. Yeah.
Thank you very much again
Thank you
one
very
more
much.
time. Fantastic. So.